It is the arrest that sent shockwaves around the world and through markets as Mounties arrested Meng Wanzhou, the chief financial officer of Huawei, the Chinese tech giant. Meng is often called the queen of China's tech industry, but the RCMP arrested her as she tried to change planes in Vancouver earlier this month. Meng is now facing extradition to the U.S. China has denounced the arrest as a serious human rights violation. So why did Canada make the arrest, and will China retaliate? Joining me now from Toronto is Canada's former ambassador to China, David Mulroney. David, thank you so much for joining us today. Such an interesting story. Why do you think the Canadians made the decision to arrest this high-profile woman?
Well, I think if what's happened is a request was sent in through the U.S. for extradition, we take that very seriously, no matter who it is. I think sometimes we cringe knowing that there will be political ramifications, reverberations, but this is how we operate.
So when the Prime Minister says there was no political direction in this, you believe this was purely an RCMP decision to arrest?
Absolutely. I mean, the Prime Minister said he got a heads up, which would be par for the course. But not only would he not be asked whether it's okay, I don't think he'd want to answer that question, because there's no way that the Prime Minister would want to be accused of stepping into something, particularly if, as suggested, it involves allegations of violating Iran sanctions. He'd want to stay a long way away from that.
What is the reaction like to this story in China?
It's very interesting. Chinese media has been reporting on it carefully. A few journalists in the more nationalistic press have vented their frustration with Canada and with the U.S. But for the most part, it's been pretty careful and quiet. And on social media, one very vitriolic blogger said, read this before it gets pulled down. China monitors its social media very carefully, so there have been little eruptions, but it's trying to keep this from boiling over.
Do you think that Canadians who are traveling to China or working in China have to worry that they could face retaliation and the Chinese government or police could decide to arrest them?
This is something that people have been talking about. I think it depends on, ultimately where this goes and how serious it becomes. I think the Chinese are very frustrated with this. There's no doubt about that. And if it gets more embarrassing to them, if Madame Wang does not return to China in the near future, pressure will mount for some kind of tit-for-tat retaliation. We've seen things like that from China in the past, and we can't rule it out. I just don't think we're there yet.
Is there a risk that there could be retaliation on the trade level or in terms of cyber attacks?
Cyber attacks are always possible. On the trade side, I think what will happen is, the Chinese make it so that you make no progress unless you have high-level exchanges. We had Minister Mulroney in China not so long ago. The Prime Minister has raised this. What they might simply do is, and I think they will do, is turn up the deep freeze, really postpone high-level exchanges so that nothing can possibly happen while they're expressing their displeasure, and that could be a matter of many months.
Now, of course, this all comes at a time when there's been tremendous tension between the United States and China, the tariff war, which seemed to have a bit of a détente when Donald Trump sat down with his Chinese counterpart around the same time that this senior executive was being arrested in Canada. Does this affect the relationship between the U.S. and China when it comes to trade?
Hugely. And I think Chinese officials appear to be trying to signal that they're not going to connect these two issues. They're very happy to have been granted a 90-day ceasefire. The American tariffs were hurting. I don't know how long they can continue doing that, as Chinese citizens are outraged by what's happened, and they don't want to get on the wrong side of their citizens. So depending, again, on how far this goes and where it goes, it could completely disrupt things. It's also true that the United States has had the company Huawei in its sights for some time. There have been concerns that Huawei, in effect, although it describes itself as a private company, acts for the Chinese state and enables China's hacking of U.S. technology. None of that's been proved, but it's very much an American concern. They've also expressed some concern, and some leading Americans have expressed concern with Canada, because we have a warmer relationship with Huawei, and we're just about to make a major decision as to whether Huawei could be allowed to be part of the next generation of information technology, the 5G revolution that's coming to telecoms very, very soon.
Well, and do you think that this arrest perhaps will affect Canada's decision on that?
Absolutely. It couldn't come at a worse time. It makes it very, very difficult for the Prime Minister, for the government, to go forward with a partnership with a company that has a cloud over its head like this. And I don't think that cloud is going to dissipate. I'd be surprised if it dissipates soon. So timing's really bad for Huawei in Canada and elsewhere. Britain is also a major client, and they've been having some second thoughts.
The fact that this arrest warrant was put out by the United States for one of the most high-profile Chinese citizens you could imagine, do you think that it's intended to send a message to China?
That's very much how it's being read by the Chinese. They're seeing this as the Americans holding hostage a leading and much respected Chinese business person. I think it's also true, though, that the telecoms companies in China have come under suspicion in the U.S. of violation of the Iran sanctions. A smaller company, but still a very important one, called ZTE, has run afoul of the Americans a couple of times. So it's a sector where they have their eyes open, and they're not averse to snapping up major players in corporations that come under suspicion. The interesting story coming out of the United States is whether or not President Trump knew about this when he sat down, as you mentioned, with Chinese President Xi Jinping, because the arrest was happening at roughly the same time. It appears that he didn't know this, which is a little bit surprising. But even if he had, it's hard to imagine what he could have said to President Xi.
Now, we just have about a minute left, but I'm curious, do you think that this affects Canada's ability to get a free trade deal with China, or are we going to be seen now by the Chinese as having sided with the Americans?
Well, the Chinese like to politicize their free trade negotiations, and they like to portray them as a favor they confer on a country after it's been seen to be good and trustworthy in its behavior to China. So they're going to make us fear this and feel this, and we'll be in the deep freeze for some time. At the same time, China wouldn't be interested in doing a free trade deal with us unless they had some interests here. So those interests aren't going to go away. I suspect we're going to be in the penalty box for a while.
David, fascinating. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Mercedes. Take care.